Let's talk to Philip in Mission Viejo. You're on the program, Philip. Hello.
Hey, congratulations, guys. You're doing a wonderful job.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is this. In the Old Testament, people lived 900 years. So a couple questions relating to that is, how were they able to live 900 years? And the next question is, did they use our current calendar or a different one? And what scriptures can support the answers to 1 and 2?
They probably lived so long because there was no processed food back then, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
No In-N-Out burger, I don't think, in Genesis.
Well, I mean, as far as people living long, I would say that, the global flood is one option that people will say that post-global flood, you can see a big difference in how long people were living. There is a theory that's largely been rejected, by creationists, and that is this canopy theory that says that there was a canopy, over the face of the earth, and it sort of protected, the environment down on Earth because the ultraviolet rays weren't able to go through and sort of toxify humanity, thus shortening their lifespan. And then the other thing would just be after the fall, which I think would make good sense, is that there was this element of genetic entropy that began to take place. And so I do think, like John Sanders, I had him, he is the author of the book, I think it's called Genetic Entropy. I've had him on the 1 Minute Apologist. And he talks about this whole idea that how each of our kids have 100 more mutations than we do. And so we're literally mutating to death. And so I could resonate with that as well. So it's not hard for me to imagine that, before, all this toxicity came into our environment and the pollution, you wouldn't have, if you had a news station back at the beginning in the Garden of Eden, you wouldn't turn on a channel if you were living in Southern California and you were getting the news about what's happening around the world. You wouldn't hear about environmental pollution like we do when we turn on the news today.
Sure.
So
I think that obviously you're a good apologist. You've covered every one of these issues that sometimes apologists will bring up. I think the idea that this is the purest form of humans would be the first pair.
yes.
And so genetically they'd be the purest form of humans also. But, okay, so there's a couple other things about that. As far as the calendar goes, the Gregorian calendar that we use today was not in place, and the Jewish calendar was a little bit different. And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, you could even argue that the Jewish calendar is being used as far back as we are, if you're talking about Genesis, right? So I don't know that you could even argue that whatever dating system that the Jews were using, say, post Moses, would even be in place pre-Moses. But it doesn't really matter. Here's one thing I would say. I find that we sometimes are trying to figure out, how can I get the best natural explanation for something that appears to be unnatural? But if you think about it, everything in Scripture is predicated on a supernatural worldview. Look, if there is a God outside of space, time, and matter who blinked everything into existence in an instant, our universe did not exist. We know from the science. There was no space, time, or matter before our universe began. These are all things that require one another in order to coexist. So it's not like we had a void, a spatial void, and then God creates the universe. No, there was no spatial void. That's not a nothing. That's a something. Everything in our universe came into existence from nothing. And space is not nothing. Space is something. What is nothing? Nothing is what rocks dream about. Nothing. Okay? So if there's a God in Genesis 1 that can blink everything into existence from nothing, then the most dramatic miracle, the most dramatically odd thing and supernatural thing is not the age of people in Genesis. It's not any miracle in the New Testament. It is Genesis 1, blinking everything into existence from nothing. So the book starts with the premise that we believe in a supernatural being who's going to do supernatural things. Don't be surprised to find on the pages of the Old Testament crazy things that seem unreasonable from a purely natural. That's your naturalistic presupposition that causes you to try to explain this. I've seen people, for example, who will try to explain the parting of the Red Sea by maybe it's a small portion of the Red Sea. In those days, maybe there was a tributary that they could be called the Red Sea, and maybe there were strong winds. Now, look, guys. If God parts the Red Sea, that's nothing compared to everything in the universe coming into existence from nothing. If you can do that, you can do the other. I don't rush to a naturalistic explanation for the parting of the Red Sea. No, God did this supernaturally. And he had some reason to do this supernaturally. And so
the question that confuses people then, Jim, sometimes is like, okay, I get that, but we're not seeing it today.
Right.
We're not seeing people live that long today. We're not seeing these type of miracles today. How would you help our listeners kind of grapple with that?
Well, so it's almost as if to say, well, there's nothing supernatural happening today. And that, you know why we don't think there's anything supernatural happening today? Because every time something supernatural happens today, we want to assign it to medicine, chance, or luck.
Yeah, we can explain.
We seek to assign. I'll give you an example of this. I never noticed God's work in creation when I was a non-believer because I would always assign it to some other cause.
Yeah.
For example, have you ever I remember there used to be this thing, a slug bug. Remember, whenever you saw a Volkswagen Beetle,
Yep.
if you owned one or if you didn't, if you didn't own one, you would slug the person sitting next to you, and you say slug bug.
Yep, I remember that.
Okay, great. Well, it turns out if you're looking for Volkswagen Beetles, you'll start to see them everywhere.
Yeah.
But if you're not looking for them, you're like, I don't know, do they even still make them?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're all over the place. You still see them here in Southern California everywhere, but you're just not sensitive to them. You're not looking for them. The same thing kind of happens with God's miraculous activity in our world. I don't think that God's any less active in the world today. I just think we've gotten to the point where we just don't see it anymore, and we don't want to see it.
I do think when it comes to some of these like massive, like a pillar of fire hanging out over the tabernacle, or some of these real like miracles where God's like in a burning bush, but even those miracles, they're actually really far and few between in the Bible, and those miracles were happening at transitory times. So you see them kind of heightened with a Moses and Elijah, or you see them heightened when Jesus comes on the scene or with the apostles, or you see them that they'll be heightened again in the eschaton. And this is kind of like shifting stages of history. So for those of us that would be skeptical, thinking, well, we have never seen anything like this in our lifetime. Well, we might if the Lord does come again, because you can look at Book of Revelation, and there's a lot of stuff that's going to go down.
That's a great point. I'll tell you something. If you just do an actual survey of history from the Old Testament through the New Testament, and you think to yourself, well, God works in miraculous ways, right? So is there like an even placement of miracles from Moses? No, there aren't. As a matter of fact, all the miracles in Scripture are bunched up largely around four characters: Moses, Elijah, Elisha, and Jesus. That's interesting, right? About 80% of those are bunched up around Moses and Jesus. What's the deal with that? Miracles are not here to tickle your fancy. Or so you can explain the world. They're here to authenticate messengers.
That's right.
And we know this from Peter, because Peter says this in the first preaching on the Pentecost. He says, you killed the author of life. You killed a man we know was God because he was attested by miracles. The idea, so I don't expect to see those kinds of miracles again until the messenger needs to be authenticated. If that's Jesus is the last. That's why I always say, if people say, God never talked about that and I think if he was here today, he would say something about this behavior or about this theory about identity or whatever it is. Really? Well, if he's going to come again and give us a new message, there will be a messenger authenticated by miracles. Until that dude shows up, I'm going back to the last messenger authenticated by miracles, and that is Jesus.
Yeah, well said, Jim.
So I think a lot of this is just, now I was not going to explain why the 900-year stuff, but I would just say that all the things you talked about, the canopy theory, the genetic theory, a lot of that stuff has been talked about. But in the end, let's don't try to naturalize something that is clearly supernatural and for whatever reason demonstrates the glory of God.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting? I just finished up John Lennox's 2084 book, and you kind of think about it's a little bit of a play on Orwell's 1984 idea. But you think about AI and how sophisticated this intelligence could be. And, then he's even talking about, listen, the problem could be with AI is what are the morals of those who are, putting in the information on how these intelligent automatons are supposed to operate. Well, when you step back, you think about like what we're doing today. We're doing everything we can to build our own Babel, to live as long as we can, to harvest organs so that if anything happens to us, we're kind of in that pursuit to extend life. But God already told us, I'm limiting your years to 120.
Yeah,
and we're trying to
extend them out.
Yeah,
I think for me, again, I'm always just trying to make sure I don't take my naturalistic presupposition in here, right?